Hey, welcome to Dirk Island. This is the weekend show where we watch interesting documentaries and talk about them.
Okay, so we just watched Mercury 13, documentary on Netflix about 13 women who successfully passed a space training program, the goal of which was to get them into the Mercury space program during the space race with Russia in the 60s. They went through testing and then were denied
Consideration for the space program
because of their gender. This is the thing in history where you see an accepted narrative, or you see a broader narrative that is what we say, and then what was kind of cleaned aside in that narrative to make it nice and clean, acceptable in the American narrative afterwards. You know, even if you want to accept the American narrative, the greatness of what America did to come together and invest money into space and all the technological advances and all the just the marvel of that accomplishment, the national unity that created, and the national pride that left Americans with throughout the rest of the Cold War and throughout even to today, thinking that's something that America accomplished first in the world. It's still something that people kind of look back on as a prideful moment. So seeing what has been swept aside, perhaps a little bit within that narrative, that is ugliness. There's nothing perfect, and it's in the genre of a little bit of revisionist history, not in that you're seeing something completely flipped, like some narratives can be, like you thought it was this way, but it's actually the exact opposite. But even if it was this way, you're not seeing all the little things that you might be not so happy about in retrospect, and that's one of the interesting things about looking back on what really happened with colonialism, what really happened in deeper parts of history. And all of that exists in this documentary, which makes it kind of just, if you're just trying to learn history, a good type of movie to watch to kind of understand. There's usually always some sort of underbelly to whatever you might be really happy about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I liked it a lot. I liked how it put a new perspective on the space program and a lot of unknown but significant space history that I hadn't heard of at all, and people who were very relevant to the progress leading up to the first woman in space. I love this kind of documentary. And it had some interesting insights I noticed just with the way societal progress worked, and there was definitely I had a lot of cynicism as we went through. I mean, one thing that was kind of a pessimistic thought is how clearly privileged each woman was who were kind of on the forefront of female aviation. I mean, most of them in the beginning, as we're meeting the characters, had access, which isn't, they don't dive into it too much because it's a distraction, but they all had access to aviation from a young age. They were all clearly one percenters. I mean, not just upper class, but probably one percenters who had access, parents who owned and flew planes, and that is what it took. And it's just an interesting way to think about our society and how we like to believe any person any dream, and for women to even get close and eventually get denied from a space program, they had to be one percenters to even have access to this world. And I wonder what their counterparts, the men who actually got to go to space, what their background was, and if they were also just as privileged, or if there was more of a open meritocracy for the men, meanwhile the women only of extreme privilege even had a shot of touching that world.
Yeah, I agree. I had the same thing. I think that even though I was talking about, this is a story that shows we've got the grand narrative of the American space program, and then we've got the underbelly story, which is the Mercury 13. And within that underbelly story, we're talking about the fact that Russia did put the first woman in space, and that one of the women who could have helped this program along almost betrayed the cause. Two little underbellies to that. The other thing, but there are certain things in this story that are alluded to a bit that are not so explored, that are also a little bit of an indictment if you're really trying to keep peeling back the layers of the way that society works and has always worked even at that time. I mean, the people who became the Mercury 13, and I think it started with 23 women who were given the opportunity to test for this. those women had an incredible amount of flying hours at a time,
in some cases.
at a time where most people could never have access to a plane. And even today, most people, unless they go and try to join the Air Force at a young age, it's very difficult for any person to have access to an airplane. It's just such an elite thing. And for many sports like golf, for example, before maybe the last 20, 30 years, sailing, these types of things are very difficult for the average person to access. Riding horses. I mean, there are places in the country maybe where you could, have access to a horse if that happened to be part of your family. It doesn't have to be a super upper class thing, but there is always an element of an exclusion beyond simply gender that is kind of an undercurrent here. Mm-hmm. The other undercurrent that I thought was interesting, and this is unrelated, but the other undercurrent I thought was interesting was what they were doing with the tests and how unstructured it seemed. No one could really explain what was exactly being tested for or why. They say things like they were given enemas every day, and the men seem to say this stuff too. They were getting water shot into their ears. They were in sensory deprivation tanks, weightless, areas. That seems like a legitimate test for space, but given all sorts of things that almost seem like probes and very strange things that anyone would have been testing someone for. And this was done to men too. It done to men first before the women were invited to test for the same program. But just a general lack of I guess maybe there wasn't a lack of oversight, but the fact that no one can really explain what any test was testing for or how they were passing, like they clearly went through excruciating testing, both physical and psychological. So like being in a sensory deprivation tank for many hours to the point where they're figuring out when someone's essentially going to start hallucinating and can't handle it anymore. Mm-hmm. So these are clearly very extensive tests, but not so clear as to whether or not it was totally overseen correctly. And I guess it's our modern suspicion of everything, any type of test or any sort of authority situation where people are given, saying, oh, if you pass this, you could be an astronaut. That's your lifelong dream, or whatever they might say. You can be in Hollywood. You can. I'm a priest, whatever someone is, those types of weird, or I'm a football coach, those weird authority situations are the type of thing that now we're like, oh, we got to worry about what kind of things are they making people do, because people just submit in those scenarios. Yeah. And this is completely, they just talk about how weird the tests were. They don't actually go into it. It's like it could be its own category. And it's also, you see, the same way that would be an underbelly to the narrative that they're saying, which is that these tests were things that they passed, which prove that they are qualified to get into the space program. That's the narrative that this documentary is about. And the narrative that this documentary is about undercuts the American narrative of the space program being this grand, almost like shining star of accomplishment, which it is, but it also, everything has these other layers. If you were to say that these tests in any way were bogus, or any of them were not actually well designed, that would undercut the fact that we're supposed to be saying that these tests were actually something that were a very large accomplishment to pass. So it is funny seeing these narratives and seeing all these trains, and if you were to start pulling the string on something like, well, why the hell were these tests being done? Were they actually proving anything? That would cut counter to the fact that all these women did go through excruciating tests, and then to be denied is almost a greater injustice.
Yeah, it's interesting. It definitely happened at a very peculiar time in history where our entire country seemed to react in this pretty fanatical way to Cold War competition and pressures, and the amount of pressure that you imagine comes about from the budget they're spending, from the need to win, and the national pride that's at stake, and how the national pride is connected to the country's success at large on a global stage. And you think about this unique period where certain doctors or certain people in really crucial positions were maybe given this unchecked version of authority and power. And it is funny that the astronauts say these things about how they were tested that make you, lift your eyebrows now, but they don't say it with any version of critical thinking back then. And you really do get the sense that probably a good portion of it was not vetted. Because who questions the doctor?
Mm-hmm. And at the time, they don't really know what you're going to encounter in space. That's part of them. They're having to test on both ends, so they're probably doing things that we don't know if you go into a zero gravity situation, if it's going to be like stretching your insides out. So maybe we're going to test out whether or not your insides can be stretched without you having some sort of crazy, I don't know what the hell was going through their minds. Maybe they were thinking things like that.
The documentary definitely did a good job of, as you're watching it, though, I think what we're getting at, there was little bits of texture of the way you see the story and opens you up to, there's the historical kind of straightforward narrative we already have, and the documentary in a couple different ways makes you just rethink from the different perspectives you could see this story of the space program, which I always kind of like. And I think some of them weren't intentional. The focus was kind of the struggle of women to flight, but there's so much mixed in there with this era.
Yeah. I mean, the Mercury 13 itself, I read, was actually not what they called the group while they were doing the program. So when they were doing the program, that was, I guess, invented by kind of an after-the-fact name that was applied to the group of women. And it was because it was kind of like this guy, Dr. Lovelace's testing group of women, who he put up, and they went and had congressional hearings to see if they could go forward with their program, which was ultimately denied. But the 13 and the Mercury word is to say that if these women were approved, they would have likely been involved in the Mercury missions. But the problem is that this whole testing portion was done essentially from an outside organization, and NASA just said, I know you've tested these people, but we're going to take the men you've tested, we're not going to take the women you've tested. And they never actually became formally acquainted with NASA until the 1990s, when the first woman was put into space as a pilot, and then all the remaining women who were alive from the Mercury 13 were invited to watch this, as you kind of see later in the film.
That was kind of a moment. It was interesting to choose this story, I thought. One, because didn't feel like the story of how women first got to space. It felt very much like the story of the women who should have had a chance and were denied an opportunity to get into a space. And by the time during the Clinton administration where the first woman gets into space, you feel like it's too little too late. I mean, there were eligible women decades prior, and it's kind of like during the bulk of this story, you would have thought, oh, we're just years off. And to get the final victory 20 years later, it didn't feel like a very positive narrative. It kind of felt like just a critique on the limitations of our sexist civilization in the framework of the space program.
Yeah, definitely a nice thing to see in the context of the movie, but it feels like a post-host, a pardon for someone who's already served their time, and they have no chance. It's not actually going to make a big difference at this point. So that was,
I thought that was interesting. Two things. It was one, that just how it wasn't really a story of people changing their minds and us growing as a civilization. It felt, too little too late on the sexism front, and it felt like sexism won. And then also it's interesting, we're talking about the space program, which itself has dwindled. It's not learning the roots of how, we're now look where the space program is, look where women in space are. I couldn't name you one astronaut. I mean, there's one guy who does YouTube videos that I know of. I really couldn't tell you much about our current space program, and I think the average American hasn't, because the perception is it's dwindled. So it's an interesting story to tell, where you look at the modern day and there's nothing hopeful. We're not seeing the start of something that grew on to become a relevant part of American life.
What would have been, what should have been, what could have been.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really interesting to explore in a documentary, or anything when you're thinking about history especially.
Mm-hmm.
You think about what would have happened if someone didn't win one war and someone else did, or what would have happened if if Columbus didn't come to America.
Mm-hmm.
Those counterfactuals are not. They don't necessarily indict the history as is, but sometimes they do, and sometimes you can think about what positive things would have happened and what negative things would have happened. But the fact that we can think about would have, could have, should have is, I think, very interesting and a very crucial part of looking at history.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about learning it.
Mm-hmm.
It's about seeing it and
Mm-hmm.
seeing the fact that history has multiple layers and has things that you can ultimately say are great and positive, and things that are ultimately negative and troubling. And history doesn't have to be all good or all bad, and I kind of like looking at that, because that's a good way of looking at today. You realize that some things can be both good and bad at the same time. You can accept the narrative, but you don't have to be blind to all the counter-narrative points. You can agree with a position that the government is taking or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have to be so agreeing that you ignore all the legitimate criticisms.
Mm-hmm.
And that also allows you to be 51% for something and 49% against, which ultimately leads you to be for something. But then if the 49% gets a couple more good arguments in the other way, you can switch.
Mm-hmm.
You have that ability. And I think learning history like of this sort allows you to see that a lot of things do have many sides, and you really need to be conscious of, if you really want to know the story, there's no good use of just accepting the total narrative, even if you think the narrative or whatever happened was maybe, fine. It's really interesting to see that injustice is happening all the time and has happened all the time, and history might have been different. Yeah. Or at least if you're learning about it, you're learning about what it really is. You're not learning some iron. You're peeling away the ironed out, the smoothed out version of history.
That's interesting. I definitely feel this documentary did a great job of applying the lens of sexism to the progress of the space program in the United States. But to me, it's just adding one layer of perspective. I don't think it's giving a counter argument to the main narrative. Just to say it more plainly, I don't think this is the whole story or a more accurate version of story. I think it's just showing how, reviewing, recombing history through the perspective of sexism and equality adds a lot more context to everything. But, for example, just looking at gender doesn't look at the entire story. Something you mentioned was they were in a program that was not part of NASA. They weren't in an established program. One thing I learned, I used to, from one lens, I thought of going to the moon as just an endeavor of human exploration. This is for the good of science and for the advancement of man. And then when you look at the Cold War, from a more pessimistic view, you realize Cold War and inter-nation competition fueled this type of progress. And something I used to think is, it's only scientists, it's only brainiacs who are going to space. And then you learn actually a bunch of military people are first in line to go to space, because the space program in a way is almost like a military endeavor, which is hugely biased. And does this type of documentary apply the scrutiny of if there were a bunch of men who go, hey, we're really good at flying, I learned to fly on my dad's airway and I have a ton of hours flying, versus someone who has been in the Air Force and fought. If what weight do you put on those things? And just realizing that, and it's not saying there's not ingrained sexism, it's just a critique of society. The whole program isn't this lofty thing that's purely for the fulfillment of ideals. It's for competition. There's a reason we're doing it. There's a competitive advantage. There's, to look at humanity in general more pessimistically. We don't just do these things for one reason. It's not just for the ideal of putting a man or woman on the moon. And sometimes if you were to prioritize equality, that's never been a motivation. That's, if you look back at history, that's not why we do something like a space program.
Yeah.
And equality could actually make impossible some of these endeavors. Not that I don't think that would be a good thing, but just, in a more pessimistic view, that's not what gets humans to go to these lengths.
And I think that we brought up just viewing this the way that people thought about the goals of the space program then as we do today. I think that they put a chimpanzee into space before a human,
mm-hmm.
and that is something that both of us were thinking, oh well, I mean, are they just willing to kill that chimpanzee?
Yeah.
Because that chimpanzee was not able to sign a form saying, I consent to this. If I die on this mission, that's the risk I'm willing to take for the greater good of America.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas even if you allowed a person to be, you could at least get over some of those moral qualms about
mm-hmm.
consent. But, I mean, obviously, especially at the time, people just don't. I mean, you don't care about an animal to the same way you care about a human. And so that's, putting up a dog or a chimpanzee is not not as much of an issue for people. But
mm-hmm.
I do think that I wonder if, what it's difficult because you get so far back. Like, for example, if Russia had beat the United States to the moon because the United States decided they were going to have a certain standard in their program that they
mm-hmm.
upheld, like, whether maybe it was a wage thing. Maybe we have a lot of rules in this country about how long people can work for, what you can treat them like, things that you can do to them, and all sorts of anti-discrimination. And realistically, and what you could do to animals too, in this country. And we have those standards knowing full well that it could increase costs,
mm-hmm.
but we believe that we're willing to pay those costs because we have greater good sometimes, like the welfare of people or the welfare of animals or
mm-hmm.
equality. And saying that we would be a little bit slower or a little bit, we would definitely produce less, or we produce animals for food consumption
mm-hmm.
at higher cost, but perhaps less of them because we have standards, whether it's around fishing or whether it's around, animal welfare. We produce less and we produce it at higher costs because we have standards. And I just don't think that's a bad thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think that's a bad thing to have is standards about how you can treat animals, how you can treat humans, and knowing full well that will increase costs, lower the amount of production. But what is it all worth? Is the problem. Is I don't necessarily know that any of their arguments were even valid to hold up the space program. It seems like it's really just a vestige of a sexist culture that kind of allowed this to be the case, where it was kind of sexism and not allowing women to get jet flight experience and all the other mm-hmm. prerequisites that they might have been rolled over, and an opportunity where they might have been able to say, well, there is a group of women who has a lot of flying experience, like could probably do mm-hmm. this. And was able to pass all the same tests as the men. In a moment, they could have said, "Well, okay, let's be egalitarian. Let's have a standard that is a higher level for what America stands for." They did not choose that route and chose a different route, which was we want the fastest. We want to be on the moon fastest. And what we can do is we can take people who we know have already flown jets and have more experience because we've only been allowing them to have that kind of experience. And they chose one option versus another. But I think today, and even at all times, you do always have the option of choosing to have a higher standard for the known sacrifice of either time or production or whatever it might be, And the known sacrifice might give you many other benefits. One, you might be wrong about your assumptions about whether or not it's going to be deterrent. There might have been actually assets, that they could have tapped into that they never developed by allowing women to be part of the pilot program also.
And that was an interesting part of the documentary, is how they did go into with the flotation tank, the isolation tank, where they're strapped up with a sensory deprivation is the right term, and how women could handle that. And the woman had set the record, being able to be in a sensory deprivation tank for 9.5 hours, whereas the men kind of freaked out.
Sorry, we're quicker to have hallucinations.
And that was correct. After 3 hours, the average person starts hallucinating in a sensory deprivation scenario, whereas women generally were able to be relaxed and remain present during that, which I thought was cool. I thought that was a fun idea proposed by the documentary, is just thinking about, even if your main goal was to have the most competitive edge, how being sexist might actually be shooting ourselves in the foot. We're losing out on a potential advantage that females inherently would have over men, even if you're going just by the numbers, just by the testing.
Yeah,
I love that part of it, actually.
I think that's
pretty pessimistic, but pretty good. Good critique, good reflection on different factors of society, especially during the Cold War space race era. Thinking about the idea of like one step for man, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And there's a funny irony to that they pointed out by saying woman and womankind, but also thinking about the Cold War dynamic to the space race, that it was definitely not for all mankind. It was the U.S. dominating Russia, which is kind of a funny irony, which I've never thought of before, which is when we get to these moments in history, we broaden it to be the most inspiring version of itself. It's like, all men are created equal. And now we look back on that and we're like, it's funny that statement that represents this ideal couldn't have been further from the truth.
When it was made.
Yes, when it was made. It was not, all men were not created equal, and it's also excluding women. There was, anything but absolute equality.
At least on the ground. They might have thought, they might have believed in the ideal, but they were not evaluating everything in their current society upon that standard, fully taking it to its limits. That is a very interesting point.
And it just makes me think about progress and the stories we tell ourselves. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And there was a part of me that learned that story as just an inspiring push for innovation and a leap for human progress, and kind of ignoring the fact that it was coming from a place of, a petty emotion of competition and us versus them, a very primal, animalistic, pretty much the least celestial theme you can think of, that drove this huge accomplishment that inspired a bunch of people for a generation.
Yeah, and the clear counterfactual that this movie presents, which is that while saying that, facts on the ground of the people who accomplished that includes an exclusion of half of society, of an entire gender within that space program. And so it is a similar thing where you're seeing that they are broadening it at the convenient time for the narrative, and not necessarily practicing that on the ground throughout the process.
Which I love.
Yeah. I don't have much more to say, or anything else to say.
Me neither. But I think that this was a pretty solid documentary in that way. I always like learning, as you say, the counterfactual parts of a historical narrative.
Yeah, or the underbelly.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. If you want to keep up with us, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube for the video episodes.